Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Freddie Mercury, the late lead singer of the rock band Queen, once asked by a reporter, "How has the band achieved so much in such a short amount of time?" Without hesitation, he responded, "The reason we're successful, darling? My overall charisma, of course." Of course, charisma, the compelling attractiveness or charm that can inspire devotion in others, and the topic of the podcast today. It used to be believed that charisma was something you had or you didn't, something that you could rely on, as Freddie did, or you could not. The discussion today challenges that notion and comes away with a completely different conclusion. My guest for this discussion is Olivia Fox Cabane, the author of The Charisma Myth and The Net and the Butterfly. Besides being an author, she is a lecturer at places like Stanford, Harvard, and Google, a columnist for Forbes and the Huffington Post, and an instructor at Berkeley, and a highly in-demand executive coach. Olivia, welcome to Intangibles. It's lovely to talk with you, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure.
In addition to being a good communicator, you seem to have a gift for languages, speaking 4, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Wow. What else would you like to tell people about yourself?
I think the biggest point that people need to realize is that I'm not just an introvert. I'm a socially awkward and inept introvert. I learned the whole charisma thing because I had to. It didn't come naturally to me. And it's because I had to learn it the hard way that I can explain it to others. And,
I'm not sure if this is really true, but you said something about raising chickens. Is that correct? Or are you just you're pulling my leg, right?
Well, whenever people doubt because they've seen me on stage and they doubt I'm an introvert, I tell them you should come over to my place. My family is 1 dog, 2 cats, 3 chickens, 60,000 bees, and I think there's still a husband there somewhere.
So it's
that
true.
Really is my life. Yeah, it is.
It's true. Wow. All right. Let's get straight into it. Can you walk us through the value of charisma and the 3 behaviors that make charisma?
Absolutely. So the values of charisma is really hard to overstate because charisma gets people to like you, to trust you, to want to be led by you. And frankly, it makes them want to do whatever you want them to do. So charisma is really it's the X factor. It's what makes a difference between whether your ideas are implemented or not. It's what makes a difference between whether people want to follow your lead or not. Charisma really can make the world go round.
So obviously that's magic. What are the pieces of magic?
Well, the first piece of charisma, the foundation upon which all else is built, is presence. Whenever you hear people talking about a really charismatic individual, you'll often hear them say, "What a presence this or that person has." Clinton, for example, is famous for that. And presence is simple, but not easy. Presence is simply the ability to stay present moment by moment in the interaction. And I mean fully present, not having your mind get distracted at any point. The second element is power. And power isn't actual power. It's not whether you command an army. It's the impression we have of your ability to affect the world around you. And the last one is warmth. And warmth is what you'll see from kindness charismatics, for example, like the Dalai Lama. And that really is 100% body language.
So putting first things first, I know that there's something called the Primacy Effect. Can you explain that for us? Because I think all of those 3 things come into play immediately.
They do. One of the things few people realize is that you really only have 2 seconds to make a good first impression. Because of our survival instincts, we tend to judge people in really tiny, tiny moments. Because if you think of it, back in our tribal times, we often only had 2 seconds to decide if the shape cruising into our field of vision was animate or inanimate, human or non-human, friend or foe, basically fight, flight, or relax. And so we make those split judgment decisions, and they influence everything that comes afterwards. The primacy effect is the name given to the effect that was noticed. The first impression you make, everything else you do afterwards will be filtered through that first impression, be it good or bad.
Yeah. So you can change it, but pretty hard to do that, right?
Exactly. Exactly. If you make a good first impression, you've got the card stacked in your favor. If you make a bad first impression, it's not impossible to overcome, but you've got a mountain to climb.
Yeah. The thing that I like about charisma is that it really has to do with the other person and how they feel. And you hinted at it earlier when you're talking about politicians. It seemed they recognize this the most. And I've heard you speak a couple of times talking about Bill Clinton.
One of the common misconceptions of charisma is people think that it's how you make them feel about you, and it is that, but it's also, and it's even more, how you make them feel about themselves. And Clinton indeed is a master at making you feel like you are the most interesting and important person he has ever met.
My wife has met him a couple of times, and that was the first thing that she mentioned in describing it to me. It was just like, I was the only person in the room. I'm like, really?
Yeah.
He's like, no, there were 70, but I thought I was.
And you can give that effect in just 2 seconds. It really is. It can happen incredibly fast, but it needs your entire presence. You can't have even a fraction of your mind thinking about something else.
So the one thing about the book, or that the book comes back to time and again, is body language. I want to approach body language kind of in both directions. First, let's look at body language from the perspective of what improves the ability to be charismatic, and then we'll look at it from what detracts our ability to be charismatic. So first things first, your order is power, or presence, power, warmth. What body language is going to be positive?
If you're looking at presence, this is one of the few where, in terms of what will help, I'm going to give you directly a tool. In terms of what will hurt, I'll give you some signs. So what you want to avoid is, have you ever been, Steve, in a conversation where only half your mind was present and the other half was busy thinking about something else?
No, never.
Right. Well,
yes, of course.
To the people to whom that happens, when that happens, there's a good chance that your facial expressions were split-second delayed, or that your eyes glazed over. And the thing is, people realize that we are incredibly good at spotting what's called microexpression, that even in 17 to 32 milliseconds, people can catch that you're not entirely present. And on a gut level, it gives them the feeling that something's not quite right, there's something off. So to avoid that, I'll tell you the real tool, and you're going to hate it, and I'm sorry, but it is true. The absolute best, most effective, most long-lasting tool is meditation. Now, let me give you a Band-Aid. A quick tool that you can use when you're in conversation, you notice your mind wandering, is to focus on your toes. Literally focusing on your 5 toes, because that forces your brain to scan your body from head to, of course, toe, and gets you physically present back in the moment.
Okay. By the way, I don't hate meditation. I'm learning over time the value of it, and I think it's significantly more than I thought.
Not only is it that, but you also have to realize that meditation is a toolkit like any other. So in the same way that you wouldn't use a hammer or a screwdriver for the same purpose, you shouldn't use insight meditation or loving kindness meditation for the same purpose. There's as many different kinds of meditation as there are different kinds of yoga or different kinds of cheese.
Right. Okay, so we're still on presence, and that is the micro expression is the thing that I want to avoid, and that causes inauthenticity. That is a big theme, authenticity or inauthenticity. So I'm going to circle that as a placeholder because I know I'm going to hear about that again.
It's huge. Yeah. So that's for presence, finding ways to bring yourself back in the moment and to not let your mind wander.
I told my wife the story that you've told about.
The Disraeli story.
Yes.
Oh, that was awesome.
And I insist. I'm insisting that you tell that because it's such a great story.
Well, it really is. And what's fascinating is that not only is the story true, but these two men battled each other for the premiership for decades. They were vying for Queen Victoria's favor. So this happened in 1886 in London when Benjamin Disraeli was up against William Gladstone for the post of Prime Minister. And since this is the Victorian era, whoever won was going to rule half the world. And in the last week before the election, it just so happens that the same young lady was taken out to dinner on consecutive evenings by each man. And so naturally, the British press asked her what impressions the rivals had made on her. And she said, "After dining with Mr. Gladstone, I thought he was the cleverest man in England. But after dining with Mr. Disraeli, I thought I was the cleverest woman in England." Guess who won the election?
Yeah. Genius.
Disraeli, of course.
Genius. Yes. Yeah, it's back to making what other people feel about you as opposed to you trying to impress upon them. I
usually tell my clients, let them impress you, yep, and they will love you for it.
I love that expression. And I will add that I observed while you were telling the story that you paused frequently and deliberately, which I also happen to know is a thing that improves your presence.
It does, but it's actually even more important for power.
That's more important for power.
Yeah, it's a typical alpha behavior. And what it's subconsciously communicating, whether or not you realize you're doing it, is that who you are or what you're saying, you're so damn confident in those that you can pause without any risk of anyone daring to interrupt you. So if you think of the difference between in Tom and Jerry, like a nervous little mouse, they'll speak super fast and at a super high pitch. An alpha will do the opposite. They'll speak slowly and they'll have the confidence to take pauses, not just between sentences, but even in between sentences at sentence breaks. And what you're hearing also is that contrary to the horrible habit that some millennials have of having their voice go up at the end of a sentence, even if it's not a question, alphas do the opposite. Even if it's not the end of a sentence, their voice goes down.
Okay, now I feel confident that I'm ready to move on to power.
Excellent.
So we're talking about the things that improve your charisma and the things that potentially detract from your charisma with regard to power.
So with regards to power, well, frankly, the same as with warmth and presence, remember that people aren't judging the real you. They're judging in a split second the impression you're making. And with power, what they're reading on you is the impression they get of how much power you have. And they read that from how much power they think you have. What this all means is that the biggest attractor to power isn't lack of physical power or bank account funds or even social status. It's lack of self-confidence. Self-confidence, or the perception thereof, that's the key to power. And that'll be read in your body language, which is why one of the best tools for that is the big gorilla tool, where you'll widen your stance, broaden your shoulders, you can even put your hands behind your back. All of this causes a psychological shift in your body, which then causes a mental shift, which then causes another physiological shift, etc. It's a positive cycle. All you have to do is get it started.
So But the lack of self-confidence, that's the thing that you touched on first. That's the potential negative, right?
That is the killer. In one of its most frequent manifestations called the Imposter Syndrome, people feel that they don't really know what they're doing, and it's just a matter of time before they're found out and exposed as a fraud. That imposter syndrome, one of the MIT deans once told me, we lose more kids to the imposter syndrome each year than to any other reason.
I think the Stanford study also had some data on this as well. Do I have that right?
If you're thinking about when they ask the incoming class, it's not an official study, it's just something that they like to do. But yes, when the incoming class of Stanford Business School, the GSB, were asked, how many of you in here feel that you are the one mistake the admissions committee made? 2/3 of the class immediately raised their hands.
Yeah, that's phenomenal, right? Because let's face it, if you get into Stanford, your chances are they didn't make a mistake.
Yeah, but here's the interesting thing. It turns out that the higher up the ladder of education you go, the worse it gets. And the current theory about that is that the more you know, the more you're aware of how vast the sum total of knowledge is and how small your own in comparison.
Okay, so that's the negative. We talked about looking bigger on the positive side. Is there anything else on the positive side that I need to take into consideration?
Well, let me jump out of the official discussion for a second.
Sure.
The answer is yes. The problem is that I can't give a 30-second answer. It is, what I can say is that we now have the tools to actually dismantle the imposter syndrome. It takes me 2 entire chapters in the net and the butterfly for good reason. So I can't give you an immediate overview. The only thing that I could say, if you think it'll be of interest to the listeners, is that it absolutely is possible to dismantle the imposter syndrome. So there's hope.
Right. Yeah. So okay. Over time, the removal of a negative will kind of be available to bring us back to neutral ground, to ground zero.
You can do it in a week. Most people who really focus on dismantling their imposter syndrome seem to take a couple of months, but it can go really fast. Okay. So that leaves us with warmth. Yeah. Pros and cons, I guess. So warmth is the one that is even more directly correlated with body language than power. In power, people will make some inferences from the clothes you wear, the corner offices, the business cards, the official titles. Even though if you think of someone, imagine if they have a very prestigious sounding title, but their body language makes them look completely insecure. Which would you trust, the title or the body language?
The body language, of course.
Exactly. With warmth, it is 100% body language. And surprisingly, the 2 biggest areas of focus here are the eyes and the voice. And with regards to the voice, that can be occasionally a problem because people who have a nasal voice, and a lot of Americans do have that, automatically have a colder voice. Doesn't mean they're colder people. It's not fair, really, because they're going to have to put extra warmth in order to compensate for having a colder voice. The eyes is something that you can control through method acting or visualization, however you want to call those tools.
Right. So, all right. All right, I'm just reviewing. So the eyes are making sure that you don't break eye contact, I think, and kind of holding that gaze.
Well, it depends.
No, okay, it depends.
You do want to give them a very attentive gaze. You can't be staring at them for 5 whole minutes without ever looking away. What you're going to notice, interestingly enough, is that often when 2 people talk, the person who's speaking will occasionally look away, especially men, since you tend to be more visual. You'll often look away when you're trying to gather your thoughts so as not to be distracted by the hundreds of thousands of units of information that are coming from the other person's body language every minute. Whereas the person listening is going to keep usually, if they're being attentive, pretty much 90% eye contact or eye on the other person.
Right.
So it's really the kind of eye contact. And so it's not just in the amount or the intensity, it's what are the emotions inside your head at that moment? Because I can guarantee those emotions will be showing in your voice, in your face, and in your eyes. And that is how people will read how much warmth they think you have for them.
And there is a physiological impact as well, right? This is the equivalent of love at first sight.
There is. This was one of the most fun studies I've ever seen when they had rows of complete strangers staring at each other for a couple of minutes. And they told the participants to count the number of times the other person blinked. And of course, they didn't care about the number of blinks. What they wanted was to get two people, strangers, staring at each other without feeling self-conscious. And at the end of just a few minutes, most participants reported feeling increased affection and some even passionate feelings for one another. And the reason for that is that when two human beings stare deeply into one another's eyes, there often is a neurotransmitter called phenylethylamine, or PEA, that goes gushing through their bloodstream and yours. And that is the same chemical that produces the phenomenon we call love at first sight.
Good to know. Good to know. I don't think it's ever happened to me, which clearly means that I'm not warm enough. but I feel hope that it's out there.
Well, this is one of the things that Clinton is famous for, and it's one of the reasons that you don't want to overdo it, but it can be very useful.
Right. We'll keep working on it. On the on the negative side. What are some of the things that can potentially inhibit our charisma with regard to warmth?
I think that really the biggest one, the most surprising, is the counterpart to the imposter syndrome, which inhibits power. The imposter syndrome is when you don't feel confident about how much you know or what you can do. It's a what focused. In warmth, it's the inner critic, and the inner critic is focused on who you are. So in a sense, it's worse. But here's the reason it's so important. Have you ever been in a conversation and you say something and immediately your brain goes, "Ooh, that was stupid"?
And yes, and then you cringe, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what your face is reacting to is self-criticism, self-judgment, self-directed coldness. But the problem is, they don't know that. All they know is that while you were looking at them, listening to them, and presumably thinking about them, they accurately read criticism, coldness, and judgment on your face. So naturally, they're going to assume that it was about them.
Yeah, completely misdirected, right? Misunderstood.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'll tell you that one of the things in studying this that I really love is that, one, it can be learned, which we're illustrating right now, and that you can dial it up and down. You gave some examples when we were talking about presence. You were talking about thinking about your toes, but I think there's other exercises, and I would encourage people to take a look at the hacks that you put in the book about this. Let's talk about some of the things that you can do to kind of dial up your charisma. I guess, well, presence first. You told us about thinking of your toes, but I think there's other ones, right?
There are a couple, yeah. With presence, it really is how much interest can you find in the person you're speaking with? And one of the reasons that it has to be genuine, it can't be inauthentic. You can't fake presence. You can't fake listening. The reason you can't fake that is because, well, let me put it this way. Were you aware up until this very second that your eyelids were continuously fluttering in front of your eyes?
I was not.
How about the position of your feet and your toes?
Nope. Also no.
Had you been aware of the temperature in the room and how it feels on your skin?
I know. I was listening to you.
Have you forgotten your eyelids again?
Yes, of course. I was listening to you.
With excellent listening. But what it demonstrates is that there is so much body language pouring out from us every minute that even when we control the main expression on our face, If what we feel inside is vastly different, sooner or later what's called a microexpression will flash across. And as we've seen, even a microexpression as fast as 17 milliseconds will be caught. And it will give a sense of inauthenticity. And nothing kills charisma faster than giving the impression of being inauthentic.
And so what you're really trying to do is to actually not have that happen. So I think we'll get into how you just avoid the micro expression altogether. But one thing that I wanted you to touch on with this before we move on is you gave some advice, may have been to Google, that was talking about improv, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you were very clear to emphasize that it must be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Well, let me break those down. Improv and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are two phenomenal tools for power. They both increase your self-confidence in different ways. Improv will give you more social self-confidence because in improv, you have no choice. You're throwing yourself into the ring, not knowing what you're going to say next, and you won't be good at it unless you're willing to say the first thing that comes to your head. The reason that I suggest BJJ particularly, I mean, listen, judo's fine. Wrestling, I'll grant you that, but it has to be a full contact sport, not a sissy sport. I shouldn't say that. It has to be a full contact sport and not something like Aikido or karate. The reason for that is that there's a certain amount of presence, whether it be boardroom presence or stage presence, that comes from being comfortable with a contact sport. There's also, let's be fair, there's a kind of confidence that comes when you know that you could take the guy down, whoever it is who's in front of you. My specialty was strangulation, and kill him. There's a kind of confidence that comes with that nothing else can match.
Okay, so we've established that charisma is not for sissies.
Well, no, listen, what I should have said is let me try to be politically correct here. I encourage you to look at many different ways of gaining more confidence, more power. And improv is one of these. Martial arts is another. I would recommend BJJ, Krav Maga, Judo, or another full contact sport. And the reason I recommended Tango was more specifically for people who do a lot of public speaking. Because one of the things that you need to realize is that when you're talking to an audience, you're back to a one-on-one conversation. The audience is a single animal. It's a dance between you and the audience. And Argentine tango specifically is one of the few truly improvisational ballroom dances. And so it's fantastic training for being comfortable moving your own body in the space, reading your partner, in this case, the audience, and responding to it.
So my nights and weekends are now, I think, officially booked up. I know where I need to go.
Excellent. Find a Gracie BJJ studio, find a Argentine tango, and then take up improv.
Yeah,
no problem.
Yeah, I'm booked up through the summer. The power. You mentioned a couple of things about dialing up or dialing down. You'd mentioned. Actually, I think I had mentioned pausing frequently and deliberately, but I think there's other things as well, right?
If we're looking at what to avoid, yes, absolutely. And what I'd recommend specifically is to pay attention to how much nodding you're doing. Now, let's be clear. There's never a tool that's going to be always good or always bad per se. It's always a question of what is the most effective in that situation. So when someone tells me, what do I need to do to get more charisma? My answer is, it depends where you're starting from. If you've got very high levels of power, but low levels of warmth and presence, you're going to have to work on the ones you don't have. You need all three. All three must be present to a certain degree in order for you to have charisma. The only thing that changes is what kind of charisma you get, depending on which of these three elements is strongest. So with regards to nodding, I will nod unrestrainedly, especially when I'm listening to someone who's feeling nervous. And the reason for that is, well, I'm rarely accused of having low self-confidence. And the problem I usually have, or the problem that I'm at risk of having, is the intimidation factor. So for me, nodding is actually good. But for anyone who needs to display more power, avoid being the bobblehead when you're nodding 6 times in rapid succession because you're trying to tell the person that you're listening to that you really, really are listening and it's really, really interesting what they're saying.
Yeah, it's approval seeking, right? And when you're seeking approval, you're ceding power.
Exactly. So again, in some circumstances and or for some people, that's a good thing and you should be doing it. In others, not so much.
I got it. Okay, warmth. How do we dial that up and how do we dial that down? Or just dial it up?
No. I'm glad you brought that up, actually. People don't always. One of the main culprits I see for too much warmth, the one place I see it time and time again is women's body language, specifically when they're on stage and or giving a presentation and or talking to a superior. You'll see their body language go into crossing their legs or standing on one foot or kind of holding both hands in a little girl position. And what they are subconsciously communicating by that is, I'm harmless. I'm really, really nice. Please like me. So that again is approval seeking. On the other hand, if you want to dial up the warmth, especially in the phone, well, let me put it this way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a fairly cold voice, and then I'm going to gradually warm it up until you can hear in my voice that I have so much affection for you. Did you hear that?
I did.
You can change the amount of warmth in your voice. And one of the fastest techniques is you don't even have to smile. Sometimes, often, even just thinking about smiling is enough to warm up your voice.
So I think what you're saying is that I need to, again, this is kind of back to mental, right? This is back to
always back to yes.
Coming to a place where you can do that and actually mean it and believe it.
Absolutely.
So having done that, there's a great story that I've heard you tell about Norma Jean Mortensen that illustrates this point about dialing charisma up or down. Could you relay that story?
Yes, absolutely. This was one summer in New York City in 1955 when Marilyn Monroe wanted to prove a point. And so with a photographer in tow, she walked down into Grand Central Station and not a single head turned. So she was quietly waiting for the subway train. She boards the car, stands in a corner of the subway car. And even though the photographer's camera is constantly clicking, no one notices her. What she wanted to prove is that she could decide whether to be your average Norma Jean or glamorous Miss Monroe. And on the subway, she was Norma Jean. But when she resurfaced onto the busy New York sidewalks, she decided to turn into Marilyn. And what the photographer said later on was that there weren't any dramatic gestures. She really just kind of fluffed up her hair and struck up a pose. But in an instant, it's as if an aura of magic seemed to ripple out from her. And people around her stopped as they suddenly realized the star standing in their midst. And crowds quickly gathered and it eventually got out of control. But this is an excellent example of what was later proved in laboratory-controlled experiments, that you can actually raise or lower people's level of charisma as if you were turning a dial, just by instructing them to display specific charismatic behaviors.
So in the subway was Norma Jean Mortensen. Out on the platform on the street was Marilyn Monroe.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that story. Okay, so my listeners, they tend to be startup founders. So I'm going to ask the next question in the parlance of entrepreneurs. There's one big hack, isn't there, that kind of puts a person in the right frame of mind to be charismatic and not have these body language giveaways, isn't it?
There is.
Yeah.
This big hack is really the placebo effect, which we tend to talk about as if it were a negative, but we really don't realize the potential it has, and we don't take half enough advantage of it. Well, let me put it this way. If you close your eyes right now and imagine lemons, just think of lemons, slicing open a lemon and drinking the lemon juice directly. Do you feel sourness on your tongue? Does your body react?
Yeah, for sure.
And even though there's no lemons whatsoever, and the reason for that is that our mind has a hard time distinguishing between imagination and reality. Or if I want to be more scientifically accurate, imagination and reality affect many of the brain's pathways in similar ways. And so just by getting yourself into the right mental state, in the same way that great actors, when they had to get all their body language in sync, they started method acting, or athletes who start visualization, you can, with the power of your mind, if you get yourself into the right charismatic mental state, your body language will automatically follow.
And then you won't have these micro expressions and you won't have these non sequiturs, and everything will make sense. And you, in fact, actually really will be charismatic.
Exactly. It will genuinely be authentic.
Yeah, authentic. Perfect. So you alluded to it earlier that there's actually a couple of different styles of charisma. People can, I'm going to let people pick those up in the book, but there's two that I wanted to break down their individual style. The first one is Steve Jobs and the second one is Colin Powell. For charisma style, for the foundation of it, for what they project, maybe we could walk through those if you wouldn't mind. Yeah.
Jobs actually is a really interesting example because he is the perfect proof that you don't have to be likable in order to be charismatic. And that's the difference between charm and charisma. Someone who's charming is automatically someone who's likable, but someone who's charismatic, not necessarily. My baby brother actually worked for Steve for a number of years, and he was one of the people who told me, oh, Steve can be an absolute asshole, and he often is. But he was incredibly charismatic at the same time. So Steve's style of charisma was the visionary charisma. And that one is really focused on not just being entirely present, but of having an idea. This could be, the visionary charisma can show up in religion, it can show up in business, it can show up in any area of life where someone is 100% committed to an idea. That's visionary charisma.
Yeah, I like this notion of having such conviction that people just believe it.
Yeah, there was a really good article. I think if you look up Carmine Gallo, I think the journalist was, who said Steve Jobs wasn't selling computers. He sold the promise of a better world. That's the amount of conviction we need to have.
Okay, and I'm gonna come back to Jobs because you did a really great blog post on this. But before we do that,
thank you.
Colin Powell, charisma style.
Perfect authority example, for good reason, of course. But yes, in his case, he is projecting confidence and strength. And you'll see that from his physical appearance, but also his body language and his voice. And the authority charisma is the perfect one to have when, for example, the building's on fire and you need everyone to get out. Authority charisma will get you obeyed. It won't necessarily get you liked or trusted, but it will get you obeyed. If you want to balance that out, you're going to have to bring in some warmth.
And so back to an earlier question, like that is appearance, that's a wide stance, that's a, strong demeanor, that's a, comfort
that's
with your...
That's all of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So back to this blog post. This is really interesting and everybody needs to go find this. What you showed was a charismatic evolution. And It was from the, I'll let you actually lay it out because it's just so fascinating.
Well, I was asked a couple of years ago to do an analysis of Steve Jobs' progression in charisma. And so I took his progression apart from 1984 to 2011. And you can literally see him gaining charisma piece by piece. And you can point out the pieces at each stage. So Steve Jobs is proof positive that charisma is a learned skill. It's not innate.
So, I love that. Can you give us at least a couple of data points along the way, or is it going to take too long?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Well, you can start in 1984. You can see that this is a nerd on stage. He doesn't own the stage. He's hiding behind the lectern. He's not paying attention to whether he's even visible. At one point, he's in complete darkness, and the audience is left with nothing but an empty stage to look at. He doesn't know how to speak, how to manage his voice. So there is a more detailed description, but just think of your typical nerd on stage, and that was Jobs in 1984.
So let's call that 1 or 2 on the 10 scale of charisma.
Yeah, I'd go for 1, possibly negative. 1996 was another video that's in the blog post where you'll see that he has progressed. He's owning the stage more, and he's projecting more confidence. So if any styles of charisma that you could attribute to him at that point would be probably focus charisma and authority charisma. He's starting to project visionary. But so he has the elements of presence, and he has some elements of power. He doesn't yet have warmth. If you look starting in 2000, where it gets really interesting, is that he started integrated techniques of stage magicians. If you think of your classic stage magician, where the whole trick is being able to control the audience's attention, a stage magician in a black cloak and black suit pulling a white rabbit out of a black top hat. And now think of Steve Jobs against dark curtains. He's in a black turtleneck, black jeans, pulling a white iPod out of a black pouch. He's learning how to control the audience's attention. So at that point, he's got the presence. He's got the power. He's owning the stage. He's moving more fluidly. And thankfully, he clearly got a speech coach to fix the way he talks to his audience. But it's really only in the, I guess you could call them the teens, what you'll see in 2011, that you start to see a real increase in warmth. And that's when you see awe and wonder. That's when he uses words like love, like beauty, which is something that the 1984 Steve wouldn't have wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole.
So that's 2007. He's probably a 6 or 7 on the scale now.
Yeah, I might even give him a 7 or 8.
Okay.
And 2011 is when he got to the 9 and 10s, that's when you see when all 3 elements come together: high power, high presence, and high warmth. And that's when you get real charisma. So, I mean, to me, going back to watch that's a masterclass, right? That's learning. If you think you don't have enough charisma, or you want to see how it's done over time, you can kind of find your own starting point in him and figure out how to move forward. I mean, in my mind, that's a fantastic place to end. But one more thing. Hey, how about that? So this is a bonus question. You don't have to answer this if you don't want, but I think it's fascinating. How do you think that charisma impacted the last presidential election? Hugely. If only we had well, sorry, that gave me away right away. It impacted the election very strongly. Had the Democrats had an even slightly more charismatic candidate, I believe the results of the election would have been very different. Trump projects his first projection is power very clearly. And interestingly enough, he does project warmth. The warmth may or may not be genuine, but in the moment, he believes what he's saying, which is why he comes across often as authentic. Presence is what he lacks, but as long as he's talking about himself, he's entirely present. So he, in my view, unfortunately, does have a certain level of charisma. Yeah, I think on the campaign trail, he was fully engaged, right? And fully engaged is presence, right? By the classic definition of it. Precisely. So, yeah, I mean, it was kind of a loaded question. There's no doubt about it. But I do think that made a big difference to a lot of people. So. Oh, that was if what Hillary, I mean, obviously, Hillary she leads with, she really leads with power. Presence comes in second. But she was so lacking warmth. And tragically, from what I've heard from people who work with her, in person, apparently, she really has a lot more warmth. it just didn't come across on stage or on television.
Yep. All right. I mean, so I think we've just added a new audience. So I think for all of those people that want to run for president, they should probably pick up this podcast as well then.
You're kidding, but I have had calls, and I cannot name them, from presidential candidates asking me to fly to their location for a charisma crash course.
Do any of them have a single name that starts with O?
No.
Okay. Look, that's what I have prepared at the moment. But I always like to finish up with three things. First, is there anything that I didn't bring into the conversation that you think we should be talking about?
I think the only thing I would say is that we finally know how to dismantle the imposter syndrome. And a big part of my most recent book, The Net and the Butterfly, was focused on that, how to dismantle the imposter syndrome and how to learn how to handle the inner critic.
Perfect. So now we need, we should be buying both books is what you're really saying. And I think that's good. Besides the books on this particular topic, any materials or resources you would point people to who are interested in diving deeper?
Yes. Robert Cialdini is the grandmaster of all things related to influence and persuasion. If you want to understand the human psychology, you must read his book. So I used to recommend the 1986 January edition. I believe that he's just come up with an update. I haven't read it yet, but usually anything Bob writes is going to be good.
Okay, we'll check that out. And where can people find you? They could follow you. Obviously, you can get the books on Amazon or someplace else, but any place else?
You can just go to my website, askolivia.com. There's a 15-minute TED-style talk that will break down first impressions so that you never have to make a bad first impression again.
I did like that first impressions one. I listened to it twice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's the end. You know that I wanted to talk to you on this topic for a while. I think it was the middle of last year or something. So I really appreciate you accommodating me here. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who has been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. And if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve BERG.